Hi, this is Mary Claire Speckner from the Bartholomew County Public Library. Welcome you to tonight's program, From Amanda to Zerelda, Hoosier Suffragists Who Raised a Ruckus. And I also want to welcome Stephanie is behind the scenes here from our Digital Underground, running the techie part of this program. And as a speaker, our presenter, Marcia Miller, as a librarian, has taught more than 4,800 information literacy sessions at Indiana State University, and she coordinates the library's social media. Marcia works closely with Indiana State University's Gender Studies program and is a board member for the League of Women Voters of Vigo County. This event has been made possible through a grant from the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial. And if you have any questions during the program, just type them into the chat and Marcia will answer your questions. Take it away, Marcia.
It's the right of every woman to mark out her path in life, to be a saint or soldier or a true and loving wife, to fill the soul with gladness and recall the world from strife as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as she goes marching on. It's her right to serve the nation in its every hour of need, her right to sit in judgment on her country's faith and creed, and show the world her courage by some high heroic deed as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as she goes marching on. Last verse. It's her right to train the children in the home and in the school, to help in framing statutes and determine who shall rule, and like man to cast her ballot for a statesman or a fool as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as she goes marching on. Good evening, Bartholomew County Public Library. That was one of the many songs that the suffragists sang over the years that they worked on the suffrage movement. It's been fun collecting them from a lot of different sources. And of course, the songs had tunes that were very familiar to people, and especially the Battle Hymn of the Republic. It seems like every other song I found was to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Later on this evening, you may well have a chance to sing another tune along with me. So warm up your voices for that one. Even though we are participating virtually, it is important to share this experience as much as possible. Thank you very much, Mary Claire, for the introduction, and thank you, Stephanie, for running the tech part. I am coming to you from Terre Haute, Indiana, and we're going to be working our way through a PowerPoint screen. So I'm going to get that up here and ready to roll. And you should be seeing a screen now that has the title of my presentation, the From Amanda to Zerelda, Hoosier Suffragists to Raise a Ruckus for Women's Suffrage. It is so wonderful to be able to share this presentation with people around the state of Indiana. It originally started, it grew out of my work as a librarian liaisoning to the Women's Studies, now Gender Studies program here at Indiana State University, and also my work within our local League of Women Voters, both of which have allowed me the excuse, although I didn't need the excuse, to do more and more research about women's suffrage and gender in general, and then of course specifically the Hoosier experience. And we have some very interesting experiences, some very interesting women. I of course am going to share just some of the many people that were involved in this experience. Before we get into specifically the Hoosier experience, I have just a couple of things to share with you. The person who was president of the NAWSA, the North American Women's Suffrage Association, when we finally achieved the 19th Amendment 100 years ago yesterday, which is amazing, is it not? Carrie Chapman Catt. She, of course, was interviewed constantly, and she came up with something that I think really makes a point about the 72-year struggle to get women's suffrage. So while we're celebrating 100 years of having had the vote, we also have, of course, are going to be talking about many of the women that were involved in the 72-year national struggle dated from 1848 and dating from 1851 in the state of Indiana. I will mention, because I am sharing the screen, that I don't think I will see any questions until we're done with that, or until I switch to the songbook screen. So we'll take that as we go. So Carrie Chapman Catt gave this following estimate that will give you a little better picture of how many people were working so diligently through all of those decades. And of course, many of them worked and died before they were able to achieve their goal of having the vote available to all of the women. And I think the fact that they just never gave up. They may have gotten a little tired sometimes, and there might have been a lull, but they just never gave up. So she estimated that 72-year struggle required more than 50 referendums, as well as 480 campaigns to get legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state constitutions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party campaigns to include women's suffrage planks in party platforms, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses. So talking about women not being fit to be involved in the political process, they were certainly more than fit and darn determined to go through that as well. So what was all the fuss about? This is it. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And then the fact that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article. Now, I'm going to do a short disclaimer. There's been a lot of stories about the suffrage movement. There were certainly racist elements to it, and especially for Black women and other people of color, male and female. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Acts in the 1960s that really cleared the path. But there certainly were movements afoot. There were separate organizations for mostly Black women in the suffrage movement, but there were other individuals of other ethnicities as well. So that's something that's sort of come to light. And one person said this was really a milestone, but it was just a moment in time for us. So this amendment, in fact, when it was first introduced, if it had gone through the United States Congress at the time it was first introduced, it would have been the 16th Amendment. And then things happened or did not happen, and it became the 16th. So what was going on? What was going through the minds of people in the 19th century? Why didn't people want women to have the vote? Was it actually that definite? And in some cases, yes. So one of the arguments was that there were spheres of influence for men that were different than women. And that shows up in a lot of the songs. So one of the spheres for women was the home, and the other one was the family. And that's where she had her responsibilities. And for men, their spheres were business and politics. And if you had a chance to see some of the images that were put out for the anti-suffrage women and men, you will see some really nasty images that actually might surprise you how vehemently nasty they were. But that's the deal. So politics was just too dirty for women. Business and politics were too hard for women. And so they just needed to stay at home and let their men take care of all of that. Well, of course, now we are in the middle of celebrating our centennial, and there are celebrations everywhere. There are new statues, there are new murals, there are events like this, and of course, especially yesterday, in Indiana, there's a lot of things going on in the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial, and certainly I'm just one of those, but there will continue to be events, and again, Indiana certainly played an important part in that. So as I said this evening, I'm going to share with you some of those people that I have been able to research. When in my work with the League of Women Voters, we have been doing programming and an actual march since 2012. And one of the things I was asked to do with that event, as we added something to it every year, was to come up with the concept I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is the Living History Badge. And so it was great to go and look for women suffragists and then try to find a picture, which is not always easy, but find some information about these people. So these are just some of the folks that I thought were good for a presentation to share with you. The first one is Celeste Jane Terrell Bernhill. She did last through suffrage. She was able to vote. But one of the reasons I put her on here is that she was a Quaker. Alice Paul, who gets a lot of national fame, came from a Quaker background. Quakers came with, and you may know some people who are Quakers to this day. They had a very equitable arrangement within the Quaker faith. And having quoted all of those things that Carrie Chapman Catt said it took to do this, I found a quote from her, and I love it when I can find a quote like this. It says, "Quaker women took the initiative in the suffrage movement. They were used to speaking at meetings and very adept in the work of organization. So that was just part of my early training and was not hard at all." And of course, other people grew into it. Another person, and I'll talk a little bit more about her later on, is here, Helen Geuger. She's from Lafayette, and she's probably what I'm going to call the most interesting person. She was, as she quotes herself, a born agitator, leader, and reformer. And again, I'll go into some more details about Helen, but basically I would not have wanted to be on her bad side. Because she sued people. She as a woman sued people. She sued people like her local sheriff. She sued people like a newspaper out east who she sued for libel, and she carried it quite a ways there. So, and also, don't assume that all of the suffragists liked one another and wanted all of the same things. Some of them got a little testy along the way, and there were some points at which she was really kind of out there, but still working not only for suffrage, but also for prohibition, temperance, and she packed a lot into her life, and we'll come back to her in a little bit. So the A in my presentation is Amanda Way, and she's the one who, again, a Quaker, she's the one who came up just a couple of years after the Seneca Falls, the one where we count the beginning, although there were certainly some things going on before that. But we count 1848, Seneca Falls. 1851, here she is in a small town near Dublin, Indiana, where you can find a historical marker, one of the historical markers that was in the loop at the beginning. And she got an Indiana Women's Rights Convention in Dublin, and they actually sort of did a rededication of that to kick off the Centennial here. So there were a number of people who signed a document, and appeared in the church that they were in is no longer standing, but trying to find some more information about her. And if you see a picture of her, you'll probably see this picture. Another interesting person who did live past suffrage is Mary Garrett Hay. And a lot of the people, of course, were instrumental in forming Hoosier organizations, but also were involved at the national levels. The two main organizations that were there in the 19th century that eventually merged into Nassau, into the one. So one of the reasons I put her here is the fact that she was a very close friend of Carrie Chapman Catt. And she left Indiana and went and worked at national levels. But the interesting part toward the end is that she and Carrie Chapman Catt are buried together. And in the burial, it says, "Here lie two, united in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause." So an interesting person there. Now, probably one of the most well-known people, in fact, I don't know that she would necessarily be thought of as a Hoosier outside of Indiana, is May Wright Sewell. And some of you may know about the Sewell Belmont House in Washington, D.C. that's become a historic site. Some of you may know about the Propylaeum in Indianapolis. And some of you may have bought your copy of this book in which the We Must Be Fearless, which came out in March. It was written by an IUPUI professor. It's a very nice history of the Hoosier suffrage movement. And so this is your first opportunity to know about a book that hopefully your library has, or they should get it. And you would certainly want to own a copy yourself. Very nice book. So she helped found one of the early suffrage societies in Indiana, the Indianapolis Equal Suffrage Society. But she also was an educator and founded the Girls Classical School. And again, eventually she moved out of Indiana and was working nationally. But you'll notice her date of death was July 22nd, 1920. So close. And there was so much happening at that point. Many states had ratified. It was coming down to the end, and she didn't get to see the end of it. So my Z is Zerelda. I don't know if there's another Zerelda out there, but Indiana has Zerelda Wallace. So she was really living in all of the 19th century. She was one of the people that crossed over from temperance into suffrage. And again, in terms of women just not being able to cut it in the political sphere, she testified in front of the United States Senate Judiciary way back in 1880. And I have a short quote here. "It is not the woman question that brings us before you today. It is the human question." Does that sound familiar to you? Can you think of anybody who has said women's rights are human rights in this century? I can. "You have attempted to do an impossible thing, to represent the whole by one half. And because we are the other half, we ask you to recognize our rights as citizens of this republic." So she is the stepmother of the author Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur. She's the wife of a governor. And so definitely she moved in those circles for quite some time. So let's come back to Helen, one of the people I want to feature this evening. Perhaps I wanted to feature her because I too came from Michigan to Indiana back in 1985. But she was teaching, she married a young lawyer, she settled in Lafayette just before the ground was broken for Purdue. So she lived through a very interesting times there. And again, she came from Prohibition And some people were also coming from the abolition of slavery movement. And she came into and back out of suffrage and into some other avenues. So she was very active in the Lafayette area, but she also was nationally known. She was often invited to go, especially to Kansas. A number of times they were working very hard on their suffrage campaign, and she would go out there. And I can't even imagine how many speeches some of these people were making on a daily basis, or even several times a day. So she came up. She started actually speaking on temperance, and she became very well known for the temperance movement. And then a lot of these women would get on to what were known as lecture circuits. And so you had your various set speeches. And so there were the times when they were campaigning for suffrage, but then there were the times when they were doing their speeches as well. So for example, she came up in 1880 with a lecture called "The Woman in the House and in the State." And she helped actually judge oratorical contests as early as 1880 that were put out by the Indiana Equal Suffrage Association. And she was also, of course, attending the earlier national suffrage movement, the NWSA, not the NA. There'll be a test on these acronyms later on. There's the North American Women's Suffrage Association. That was the big one that came in toward the end, where they merged two together. So she became very well versed in the law because her husband, the attorney, had very poor eyesight. So she had to read things out loud to him, and she learned the law, which came in handy when she started to sue people for various things. But she also became a journalist, and she actually started a newspaper called Our Herald, and it was in existence from 1879 to 1874. She again went to Kansas quite often, and along the way, she was actually identified in the publicity of the lecture circuits as the best lady platform speaker in all the land. And I think I would have definitely wanted to attend and listen to her. I think she had a very forceful, good speaking voice. They had to speak, of course, without amplification in those days. At one time, she estimated in 1887, she did 64 lectures in 5 weeks just in the Midwest. So she went to places that, they wanted her to come back again. In 1881, she addressed the Indiana House and Senate and was particularly interested in women being able to vote in municipal elections. She hosted Zerelda Wallace when Zerelda Wallace came to Lafayette. She also wrote an interesting book called How Can Women Make Money? Isn't that an interesting topic for that time? She had other publications, and in 1895, she tried to sue the election board because she wanted to vote. And in order to do that, she wanted to do her own case in front of the courts. So in 1895, she was sworn in as the first female member of the Tippecanoe County Bar. And right after she got sworn in, this starts to sound like a weird Lifetime movie of some kind. She then presented her case for 4 solid hours. And then, of course, you print copies of your argument, 66 pages, and then you sell it as a pamphlet called The Constitutional Rights of the Women of Indiana. Isn't that just marvelous? So she started getting into some alternative causes that really started to tear her apart from the suffrage movement, which was unfortunate. But you can actually look up her court case. It was Geuger v. Timberlake, And it was in 1897 when she finally got there. But this is one of a couple of pages in her earlier years when she was a handsome woman, they would probably say then. But this is a picture of her you sometimes see. And I think she was getting a little tired of that. But she didn't get up and she gave up. She unfortunately dropped dead of a heart attack toward the end of her life there. So Helen Geuger, and one of the nice things about finding out information about Helen Geuger is a man who was a journalist himself in Lafayette wrote a book in 1985 about Helen, and you can learn all of the fascinating details. He must have spent many hours in his library looking in all of the documentation. So let me get a little closer to home. Since I am from Terre Haute, I do have to talk about some of our Terre Haute connections. And recently I've been learning about even more of those connections, and we'll come to that in a minute. So here again is an example. You can see it looks sort of like a formal portrait. And this is Rose Marion Cox, class of Indiana State Normal, 1891. So she graduated fairly early in our academic life there. And you can see that some of the things she did, she helped form the Indianapolis Suffrage Society. And the main organization, one of the two main organizations throughout the state was the Women's Franchise League. She was a member of that. And then she was also active in the Indianapolis Women's Franchise League. So she was also a president of the local league that was in Terre Haute. Well, as these movements grew, they were supported in a lot of ways by these national organizations. I know you probably can't see all of the words on this page, and that's okay. I'm going to read a couple of them to you. But if you go out and do some Google image searches for women's suffrage, you'll find flyers like this. And these were produced probably by the national organizations and then sent to the states, and then the states would reproduce them. So you can see the credit for this is actually the Women's Franchise League of Indiana. Again, a very common one, and I have another one to show you in a minute. So they had to present their case. They knew what people were saying about why women didn't want to vote. And so this one is very typical. People say the majority of women don't want to vote. We say the majority never wants progress. I thought that was an interesting in-your-face kind of item at first. Another one, women will not vote when they are given the right. And then we say official figures show women do vote largely wherever they have the right. And keep in mind that a lot of women did have the right to vote to some extent in mostly the Western states before the final tally. So these are very typical. And if you're interested in seeing this more closely, I would be glad to share that with you. So that's one of the fun ones that I found fairly early on. Now, this next one specifically mentions why Indiana women should vote. But again, I think it's probably related. You would probably find a version of this in pretty much every state. So they had why Indiana women should vote. Women should vote for the same reason that men do. Taxation, citizenship, legislation. And again, citizenship. They were big on this. Why did we have the American Revolution? Taxation without representation. They said a lot of this. And women who can own property, in some cases, they have to pay taxes. They should be able to vote. Citizenship. The ballot is an educator in citizenship, and enfranchised motherhood will bring forth a race which has never been equaled for nobility, heroism, and true patriotism. How's that? And then, of course, lots of things about legislation. And actually, one of the things that a lot of the antis were worried about, especially the men, was the deal that if more women became voters, then they would not be able to do things like drink. And of course, right before the 19th Amendment, we had the 18th Amendment, just right before when the suffrage came through, which was prohibit, national prohibition. We all know how well that worked out. So early on, I started looking for photographs of suffrage in Indiana. Here are a couple of the ones that I found. Auburn. A lot of people would come with uniforms. You'll hear people talking about when they were marching, they would have, especially they would like to dress in white, but a lot of people would have different uniforms. This one looks sort of like a marching band uniform to me. And we have on the right-hand side, Fort Wayne, which seems to be integrated not only with men and women, but I do think I see a few people of color mixed in there. So I found that a very interesting picture as well. Well, meanwhile, back in Terre Haute, back when Indiana State University was still Indiana State Normal, in 1913 was formed the Equal Suffrage League. This was kind of the name of a lot of college level organizations in those days. And this was their emblem. And we were so glad when one of my fellow league members found this in the yearbooks, because we produced some t-shirts and buttons that had that emblem on that. So in the yearbook for 1913, they had the photos of many of the members of this Equal Suffrage League. I would love for someone to research all of the universities and colleges that were around at that time and see what was going on those colleges. So in the 1913 yearbook was a little bit an excerpt of the following. On Friday noon, December 5th, 1913, was organized the largest and most democratic body in the state normal school, the Equal Suffrage League. The league includes both men and women of the student body and of the faculty, and has a charter membership of over 200 to begin its work. 4/5 of the faculty have signed its constitution, and the purpose of the organization as set forth in the Constitution is, quote, the dissipation of the ignorance and indifference which exists with regard to the equal suffrage movement. Isn't that great? One of the things I found interesting was that the president in 1913 was not from Indiana, but from Granola, Oklahoma. I have not been able to find out anything about Louise Barber. I have to wonder, because people were pretty insular in those days. I wonder if she had Indiana connections that would have put her in Terre Haute during this time. There's information about this organization in the 1913 yearbook, the 1914 yearbook, and then it just disappears, unfortunately. A couple of other Terre Haute folks, Bertha Coakley. She was the only known African-American member of the Equal Suffrage League of Indiana. And she also was a teacher. She was here getting an education degree. And then someone who actually lived on the same street that I live on in Terre Haute. She lived a few blocks down. She again was president of the Terre Haute Franchise League. But also, and you look at a picture of someone and you immediately make certain assumptions. And this woman just looks like a sweet, nice, probably quiet lady, right? Except, again, she was president of the Terre Haute franchise. She was the first woman to serve on a jury and as foreman of a jury in Vigo County, and was also the first woman member of the school board and the park board. So I think that she might have looked quiet, but she definitely was not. Well, probably one of the most famous people to come out of Terre Haute is Eugene V. Debs. Ran for president 5 times on the socialist ticket, the last time while he was serving a prison term for treason because he had come out against the First World War. And they had created the Espionage Act, so he was serving time in prison. So he had a lot of interesting opinions about lots of things, as did his wife, Kate. And he As early as 1903, in an issue of the London Saturday Review, said that man's superiority is shown by his ability to keep women in subjection. That was a comment that had been made by an earlier publication. And he responded, "Such a sentiment is enough to kindle the wrath of every man who loves his wife or reveres his mother. It is the voice of the wilderness, the snarl of the primitive. Real men do not enter such sentiments. He who does so prostitutes his powers and links himself once more to the chattering ape that wrenches the neck of his cowering female, glorying as he does in the brute force that is his." So I think he was pretty definite there. And then Kate herself was no mean slouch. She did a column called The Right of Woman in 1910, and she said, to start out that column in the Terre Haute Post, "To my mind, there is no valid sentiment against the right of women to vote on equal terms with men." And it just goes on from there. So that's a copy of the article, and that is Kate in later life. So again, some very interesting people who lived not too far actually from the Indiana State Normal School. Now, you might say, why does she keep talking about Terre Haute people? I said, well, I can't help it from return for hope. But of course, a lot of people had to come from somewhere, right? So I have to talk about Ida Husted Harper. In her early years, she was in Terre Haute, and she became a writer, a journalist. But Eugene Debs brought Susan B. Anthony to Terre Haute during one of her visits to Terre Haute. And he was actually kind of surprised that as they walked through the town, a lot of people were not happy that this person bandying about women's suffrage was in town. And apparently they actually said some things that kind of startled Eugene Debs. For all of his eloquence, he seemed to be a very calm person. So that didn't stop Susan B. She then went on to do her lecture. And while she was here, she met Ida Harper. And they became close friends. And Harper left Terre Haute. She went to New York, and during the the mid years of the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony started writing The History of Women's Suffrage, which ended up being 6 volumes. So when Ida started to work with Susan B. Anthony, 2 things happened, one of which she became her actual biographer. And the other thing is Elizabeth Cady Stanton died. So Harper co-wrote with Susan Anthony, Volume 4, The History of Women's Suffrage. And then she wrote by herself Volumes 5 and Volume 6 after the end. But she also worked, of course, for Nassau and other areas. She was a prolific writer. This is a short list. I'm not expecting you to read it, but this is a short list from articles she wrote for just one publication. And if you have access to a library that has the database called JSTOR, you can go ahead and read a lot of those articles. Some of them, Why Women Cannot Vote in the United States, you would expect a person to write about that. She wrote about Susan B. Anthony, the woman in her work, right after Susan B. Anthony died. But also there's an interesting article called The Life and Work of Clara Barton. Now, some of you, if I say Clara Barton, will go, who? And some of you will go, nurse. Clara Barton was a suffragist. And so there's an article, again, that she wrote. She also worked as the secretary of the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association before she left. She divorced her husband when at a time when women did not divorce their husbands. It was usually the other way around. And again, okay, so she's the biographer of Susan B. Anthony, but what does that mean? Well, what that means is 4 volumes, and that she published in 1899. So she published it just before Susan B. Anthony died. And it says, to women for whose freedom Susan B. Anthony has given 50 years of noble endeavor, this book is dedicated. And you can find this book in the Google Books. So she was a prolific writer. She was a biographer. She did all of these things. She often wrote for the New York Times, and she's one of the few women, certainly in that era, that actually, this is her lengthy obituary when she did die back in the 1932 there. So again, Ida Harper. One of the things that's very disappointing is we do not yet have a historical marker for Ida Harper, and so we're kind of working on that. Also, I've been talking for a while, and I sort of promised, or maybe you thought I threatened, a song break, and this is a perfect opportunity to take a short song break. So what I have to do here is stop sharing for just a moment and go over to my women's suffrage songbook. And I mentioned that just as I sang a verse of the one of the suffrage songs to the tune of the battle hymn, this is your chance to sing along. So get ready, and here we go. How's that for a note? Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. They saw it in the shadows of that old New England bay. They heard it in the breezes of that cold December day. They sent it with the echoes to Britannia far away. That truth was marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As truth comes marching on. The trumpet then was sounded that shall never call retreat. Adown the century softly we hear the tramp of feet. Today we still are marching to the same old music sweet of truth still marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As truth comes marching on. We're here to swell the anthem that is heard across the sea, that equal rights and law and love is meant for you and me, where every law was founded on the plain of liberty, while truth came marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As truth comes marching on. I hope you all did that. We're going to skip that last verse here. And we have time toward the end. We'll come back and sing one more song. So the vote came from the West. Wyoming famously gave women the vote when they became a territory. Women got then they carried that through when Wyoming became a state. Between 1918 and January 1918 and June 1919, the House and the Senate voted on this federal amendment, the Susan B. Amendment, about 5 times. And usually it was defeated because of the way that the Southern Democrats were voting. So here we come. We've got President Wilson, who was not in favor of suffrage at all, but they kept meeting with him. This is when we start to get into Alice Paul and the Iron-Jawed Angels and the famous March on Washington in 1913. And finally, he came around. He called a special session of Congress and scheduled it for May of 1919. And it passed in the House and finally got to the Senate in June of 1919. And finally, the Southern Democrats, I don't know why exactly, haven't researched that, but they were going to filibuster, but they didn't. So 37 Republican senators joined 19 Democrats to pass the amendment with 56 ayes and 26 nays. And then it had to go out to be ratified. So we ratified in January 1920. So we were number 26 to actually ratify, heading towards the final ratification in Tennessee of August 18th, 1920, and then the final official signing it into law on August 26th. So during these final years, more and more women were getting involved in the suffrage movement. There had been kind of a lull in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and it kind of started picking up speed. Alice Paul has been down in Washington creating her congressional union. Kind of not the more militant, but yes, the more militant. Those are the ones who were picketing the White House all of the time. Something else was going on in the state of Indiana that seems to be fairly unique. It's related to the women's suffrage movement in that the Indiana Equal Suffrage League, along with a number of other organizations, came together to create what they called the Legislative Council of Women. And these are just some of the organizations that came together to do lobbying for things that they felt women were interested in, perhaps more so than men. And one of the particularly odd things that happened, which was commemorated back in January when we had the celebration of Indiana ratifying, was the women said, okay, we would like a room in the State House for our legislative council so that we can be close to the legislators we want to talk to. And the governor said, okay. And they gave them a room. And they actually, if you go to the State House, you need to ask, where is the plaque for the Legislative Council of Women? And they've got some interesting pictures there along the way. So they were working there. And again, some of the suffrage groups were there. Another unique piece of the Indiana history is in 1917, we almost got the vote. Well, not me, but me. The women almost got the vote. And there were three pieces of legislation that came through in 1917. And the one that made it was the Mastin-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act. It was allowing women to do some voting. And immediately they needed to get going because of the timing of it and get people registered. So the act came in February 1917. And I love this flyer because it tells people they need to register. And it says you can register any weekday from June 20th to August 20th. And women registered. Between 30,000 and 40,000 women in Indianapolis alone registered to vote. So forget that argument that women didn't want to vote, that women wanted to vote. But here's what happened with it. The Supreme Court said it violated Article 2, Section 2 of the Indiana Constitution. And all I can imagine at that moment, how mad were those thousands of women who thought that they were going to vote, and how many of them had not really been suffragists, really working for the vote, that suddenly were working for the vote. So I think that really turned things against them. The Women's Franchise League of Indiana, again, put out this flyer. They organized 300 leagues throughout the state, and 200 of them were organized in less than 2 years. So there were a lot of pissed off women. Don't mess with the women. So we're coming kind of down to the wire here, talking about suffrage. If you again go out and do some Google image searches, you'll find the most wonderful things. If you like maps, you'll find some great illustrations. This certainly is one of them. And now think, okay, women's suffrage movement begins in 1848. They want women to get the vote. Wyoming gives women the vote 20 years later. And then it's another 20 years before Colorado and then Utah and then Idaho give women the vote. And then this one I particularly like. Again, you can see it's coming out from NAWSA, North American Women's Suffrage Association, talking about what does it really mean when women are voting? What is the Electoral College doing? And also this map is great because some women were given full suffrage, some were allowed to, if you can't see this too clearly, the shaded states, you could vote on taxation, bond, and school suffrage. If it was a dotted state, which as far as I can tell is only Illinois, you could do municipal, presidential, partial county and state suffrage. And then the blue states, at the time this map was produced, you had no vote. So at this point, Indiana didn't have the vote, and most of the southern states. Can you imagine being a member of the board of electors and trying to keep track of who could vote for what? I find that just absolutely ridiculous. So finally, in January 1920, the governor says, yes, I will call a special session of the legislature. One of the reasons a lot of states had to call special sessions is they were only meeting every 2 years. So now, of course, we have a long session and a short session, but people are meeting every year. Then if you didn't hit the first session, you were out of luck for another 2 years. So when Indiana finally met to ratify, the Senate voted 43-3, and the Indiana House voted unanimously 93-0. There were 300 pro-suffrage women attending the final vote, and then they were able to go on. Now, keep in mind during this time, the Republican Party was the more progressive party, and the Democrats, and President Wilson was a Democrat, they were the more conservative party. So that's a little bit different. This person who's kind of glaring at you with the glasses, we think based on another photograph that we just recently found, that is a woman named Helen Benbridge from Indiana, who was president of the State Franchise League when we got the vote. Haven't confirmed it yet, but I really believe that it's her. And we've been having trouble locally finding a photo of her that's identified as such. So here we come, January 17th, Indiana joins the Suffrage League, suffrage list. You can see the traditional photo of a male governor being surrounded by women in hats. Very important to have your hat when you're a suffragist, ratifying the Constitution. And it wasn't that he was totally against it, but he really wasn't totally for it. He was being nagged by all of the suffragists, including his wife, Clara, that's to go ahead and do this. And the word that came down, I think through the We Are Fearless book, is that he really didn't want to call the special session until he was sure it was going to pass. I'm not quite clear on that. So that's kind of an interesting one. So here's a little close-up, again, women in hats. That's Governor Goodrich. And just to give you another picture of a man with women in hats, this is the Tennessee governor signing that final ratification, the 36th ratification. So the Woman's Hour has struck. And a wonderful book that you can read about this is actually called The Woman's Hour, which is specific to the final weeks in late July and early August. Hot, Nashville, Tennessee, suffragists, anti-suffragists, legislators who thought that they were home for the summer being brought into Nashville to vote on this. So The suffrage time, the ratification timeline is kind of interesting. Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan all ratified the Constitution on June 10th, the 19th Amendment, on June 10th, 1919. What I haven't tracked down yet is who was really first. What time of day on June 10th did those take place? And I mentioned Indiana was the 16th state to do that on January 16th, just after Oregon. And strangely, so Wyoming being so progressive to give women the vote, they didn't ratify until January 26th. So who knows what was going on with that. So finally, we're in the 26th state. This is a page from the Indiana Suffrage Centennial. Our first woman was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, Virginia Jenks, 1932. Currently, 2 women in the U.S. Representative. And so 72 years counting from Seneca Falls, 69 years counting from the start of Indiana. I do think we have time for one more short song break. And I like this song because this is a song about the victory. So let's sing a couple of verses here to the tune of Good Night, Ladies, but now it's Good News, Ladies. So let's see, what's a good note? Good news, ladies, good news, ladies, good news, ladies, we're going to let you vote. Merrily we'll go along, go along, go along, merrily we'll go along down to the polls with you. Sweet dreams, ladies, sweet dreams, ladies, sweet dreams, ladies, we'll save the country now. Merrily we'll go along, go along, go along, merrily we'll go along down to the polls with you. So fun with songs of the suffragists here. So let me switch back to go forward a few more screens. So that's kind of the conclusion of remarks, and I have a few kind of announcement screens I want to share with you. First of all, if you don't know about Suffrage100 you need to go there. And all of these, this is events going on this week. Everybody who's putting on events is supposed to make sure they get onto the calendars so that people can see. Some of them are events like this, of course, not lots of virtual events. Some are still in person. I'm actually appearing in person in Syracuse up in northern Indiana, and Vincennes, only an hour away from here. I'm going to go in person. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the hat and the mask, but we'll find out. But anyway, lots of events, but lots of wonderful information on the Suffrage100 Yesterday, again, I am a member of the League of Women Voters of Vigo County. We've been marching since 2012. And when everything shut down this year, we didn't think we were going to be able to do anything. But we actually decided to do a virtual program, which we did at 5 o'clock yesterday, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Of course, I can't put this presentation together without people being of help to me. My dean, certainly, working with the gender studies, which used to be women's studies in our multidisciplinary studies department. Again, just the fact that I am a member of the Speakers Bureau is just so great. I'm one of 11 people that's being able to tour around Indiana and talk about all of these different issues. League of Women Voters of Vigo County, our president was president until just this year. She was part of our Women's Equality Day thing. Crystal Michael Reynolds, a local historian, put together some information I've been able to use. And if you were noticing the button emblems, she and Katie Kennedy designed our buttons this year. And again, I've been a member of the Women's Equality Day March Steering Committee all that time. So you can go around the state of Indiana and find these historical markers. You can look up the historical markers, or I can tell you where they are. But also, one of my favorite trips to Washington, D.C. a few years ago enabled me to stand next to one of the original banners that the Congressional Union was using in their marches back before we got the vote. So in the spring of 1920, we had this great book come out by Anita Morgan, and she's speaking all over the state. So if you get a chance to listen to her, please do so. So We Must Be Fearless, again, that's May Wright Sewell standing there, the women's suffrage movement in Indiana. In early part of the year, until they had to close down because of COVID-19, there was this great play called The Agitators, which about the lifelong friendship, for the most part, of Susan Anthony. It was a two-person play, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. That was a very great experience at the Phoenix Theater in Indianapolis. What's coming up now? Well, I mentioned a book called The Woman's Hour, which came out about the Tennessee final ratification. The author of that book, Elaine Weiss, just published, I just got this from Amazon last week, as it says, adapted for young readers, The Woman's Hour, Our Fight for the Right to Vote. And perhaps more significantly, the second book in over 20 years to come out specifically about Black women and the vote, Vanguard, is coming out later in September. And so it says how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality for all. Keep your eye out for that book. If you'd like to see the local presentation that we did here in Terre Haute last night, if you've got another hour to learn more about what was going on with suffrage, nationally, more or less nationally, you can find our Facebook page as Women's Day March TH for Terre Haute videos. It looks like this. You can see me up in the corner there with my hat. And you can also look on there and see some of the pictures that we've had from the marches over the years. Folks, that is my presentation. Thank you for giving me the chance to do that for you this evening. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And again, if there are people that have some questions, this would be a great time, or comments, or if you want me to do it all again, I've got an hour.
Marcia, I do want to thank you. And I want to let people know that are listening that we do have the book, We Must Be Fearless. And we also have the Women's Hour, one for the kids version and the adult version. We Must Be Fearless is checked out though, so you'd have to put a reserve on it if you want to read it right now.
The Women's Hour, again, is just about 6 weeks in Tennessee, and I think it needs a mini-series. I've been collecting children's books on suffrage. Usually if I'm doing it in person, I take the displays with me, and I'm going to convert that to a digital display. I've been putting the book jackets together and reviews of the books. And one of the books that I ran into is called The Hope Chest. And you may have that. It would be in your children's section. It was being read last year by a group of fourth graders over at a charter school in Muncie. And they were doing a multi-week module on women's suffrage. And they were reading this book called The Hope Chest. And I got it on Kindle. It was a good Kindle read. And it was very nicely done. It had two 11-year-old girls, but they're interacting with historical figures and actually end up in Tennessee with an older sister. And then there's some historical information. So if you don't have The Hope Chest in your children's department, I recommend it.
Tell them. Well, we don't have any questions, Marcia. So thanks a lot for sharing with us tonight. It was very enjoyable. Learned a lot.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I wish I could have been there. I was going to spend the night. It's been a while since I've been in Columbus, look around. I have a colleague who works there, and she was talking to me about things. I think I met your state legislator somewhere along the way. Oh, yeah, back in January in the State House. And he's like, yeah, we could go to that. I could bring the kids. And, oh, well, so maybe he was watching tonight. Okay, well, thank you again.
Thanks again, Marcia. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.